Most people think of a graveyard as an ending, a place where things stop, where the story is over and the stone is put in the ground and that's the last word. But a mountain graveyard in the deep Appalachians is not quite that. These are not the manicured municipal cemeteries of cities and suburbs. These are family plots, dug by hand, on hillsides and in hollows, in the specific ground that the people buried there loved and worked and never wanted to leave. Some of these cemeteries have been receiving the dead since before this country was a country. The stones are hand-carved, the inscriptions chiseled by someone who knew the person being remembered. The iron fences are forged by hand. The ground itself, worked generation after generation, holds layer upon layer of what people were. And in the Appalachians, where the ground is 480 million years old and has been absorbing human experience since the first people came to these mountains, some of those graves haven't fully closed. Some of those stones are still listening. Some of those names are still being written. Tonight, 3 stories from people who visited Appalachian mountain graveyards and found something that should have been finished that wasn't finished at all. I want to tell you exactly what I was doing there and why. Because the context matters. Because if I'd been visiting that cemetery for any other reason, looking for any other name, I would have walked right past it. The only reason I stopped at that stone was because it had my last name on it. And the only reason I looked closely was because my last name is uncommon enough that seeing it on any stone in any cemetery gets my attention. And the only reason I understood what I was looking at was because I'd been photographing headstones for 3 hours, and I was very practiced by that point at reading what stones say. And what this stone said was my name, both names, my birth year, and a date 14 months away from the day I was standing in front of it. My name is Rosalind. I'm 38. I've been doing genealogical research as a serious hobby for 6 years, the kind that involves county records offices and church archives, and the specific satisfaction of connecting a living person to a specific line of people going back as far as the records allow. My family on my father's side is Appalachian, Virginia, mountain stock, people who came to those hills in the 1700s and in many cases never left. Tracing them requires going to the places, the county seats with their deed books and court records, and the family cemeteries, which in the Virginia mountains are often private and remote and unmarked on any official map. I'd gotten the location of this cemetery from my cousin Thad, who had done some research years before and passed along what he'd found. An old family plot on a hillside, about 2 miles off a paved road on private land whose owner had given permission for genealogical visits. I drove out on a Saturday in October. The cemetery was at the top of a long sloping field, surrounded by old oak and chestnut, enclosed in an iron fence that had been there long enough to lean in places, but still stood. Maybe 40 stones, spanning what appeared to be about 140 years. The oldest ones, the simple hand-carved tablet style of the 19th century. The newer ones, the polished granite of the 20th. I started at the oldest section, the way I always do, and worked forward in time. The stone was in the middle of the oldest section. I nearly walked past it. I caught my last name on the peripheral pass I make when I'm moving between stones. The quick scan for familiar surnames. My last name. I stopped. I looked at the stone directly. My last name carved in the tablet style of mid to late 1800s. The letters slightly uneven the way hand-carved letters are. The stone itself, a gray local field stone, heavily weathered. Lichen in the carved recesses in the way that takes decades to accumulate. I leaned in and read the first name, my first name. I straightened up. I looked at the stone for a moment. Then I looked at it again, carefully, the way you look at something a second time, when the first look gave you information you weren't expecting. My full name, both names on a 19th century headstone in a remote Virginia mountain cemetery. I took a photograph immediately, my standard practice, and then I looked at the dates. The birth year was mine. The year I was born, carved in a stone that was clearly from the 1800s, in a cemetery I had never visited before. I stood at that stone for a long time. I kept telling myself what was obviously true. it was a different person. Same name, different person. My name isn't common, but it isn't impossible. The birth year was a coincidence. Birth years repeat every generation. This was an ancestor or a distant relative who happened to share my full name and birth year. I told myself all of that. And then I looked at the death date. The death date was 14 months from the day I was standing there. Not a past date, a future date. 14 months in the future, on a stone that was clearly at least 140 years old. I sat down on the ground in front of the stone. This is not my usual behavior in a cemetery. I'm a professional researcher. I maintain composure. But I sat down on the grass in front of that stone, and I looked at it for probably 20 minutes. The lichen was real, the weathering was real, the stone type, the carving style, the font, all consistent with 1,870 seconds, or 1,880 seconds craftsmanship. The name was mine. The birth year was mine. The death date was 14 months away. I photographed the stone from every angle. Close-up of the name, close-up of the dates, wide shot showing its position relative to the surrounding stones, scale reference. Then I finished photographing the rest of the cemetery because I am a professional and I had driven 2 hours and I was going to complete the work, and then I drove home. I showed Thad the photograph that evening. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's a very old stone." I said, "Yes." He said, "Could be a relative with the same name." I said, "With my birth year." He said, "Birth years repeat." I said, "With a death date 14 months from today." He said, "Nothing for a moment." "Then that's not possible." I said, "I know." He said, "Someone could have added the death date recently, added it to an old stone." I said, "Look at the lichen in the carved recesses of the date. Lichen takes decades. The date was carved a very long time ago." He looked at the photograph for a long time. He said, "I'm going to research this name thoroughly, every record I can find." He came back to me 3 weeks later. He had found no record in any database, county record, church register, or genealogical archive he could access of a person with my full name born in my birth year in that region. No ancestor, no distant relative, no one. The name on that stone, my name, did not correspond to any documented person. I drove back to the cemetery the following month. I went on a weekday knowing I'd likely be alone, wanting to look at the stone again without time pressure. I found the row. I walked to the position. The stone was there. I looked at it carefully. The lichen was exactly as I'd photographed it. The name was exactly as I'd photographed it. The dates were exactly as I'd photographed it. And then I noticed something I hadn't noticed the first time, or hadn't registered, or hadn't been in the right state to absorb on the first visit. At the base of the stone, below the dates, there were 2 more lines of carving that were less visible because the stone had sunk slightly into the ground over time and grass had grown up around the base. I crouched down and cleared the grass gently. 2 lines. The first line read, "She came to read the names." The second line read, "She should have kept reading." I stood up quickly. I looked at the stone, at the name, at the dates, at those 2 lines. Then I looked at the cemetery around me. A woman named Edna, who owned the adjacent property and had given permission for the visit, was walking her dog along the fence line. I'd spoken to her briefly on the first visit. I went to the fence. I showed her the photograph on my phone. I said, "Have you seen this stone before?" She squinted at the screen. She said, "That's the stone that's always been there." I said, "Do you know whose it is? The name on it?" She said, "It changes." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "That stone, the name on it, it's been different things over the years, depending on who's reading it." She said it the way you'd say the creek floods in spring, a fact of the place, not unusual to her. I said, "You're saying it shows different names to different people?" She said, "Shows them what they need to see." I said, "And what I need to see is my own name with a death date 14 months from now." She looked at me steadily. She said, maybe you need to keep reading past the dates." I said, "I found 2 more lines at the bottom." She said, "Did you keep reading?" I said, "There was nothing below those 2 lines." She said, "There will be." She walked away with her dog. I went back to the stone. I crouched at the base. Below the 2 lines I'd found, below she should have kept reading, pressed into the grass at the very base of the stone where it met the ground. A 3rd line, barely visible, recent. The lichen in the carving barely started. The date is not a threat, it is a door. Not every door needs to be opened. Some can be walked past. I stood up. I looked at my birth year. I looked at the death date, 14 months away. And I decided, standing in that Appalachian mountain cemetery on a gray November afternoon, that Edna was right. Some doors can be walked past. I walked past the stone. I said goodbye to the cemetery, and I drove home. The date is still coming. I'm still walking past it. I'm going to tell you what I've seen in 40 years, not what I think it means. I'm not qualified to say what it means. I'm a groundskeeper. My job for 40 years has been to maintain a piece of ground, keep the grass cut, clean the stones, repair what needs repairing, and keep records of what I observe. I've kept very good records. What I'm going to give you is the record. The interpretation is yours. My name is Everett. I'm 78. I started maintaining the Hawthorne Family Cemetery in eastern Tennessee in 1984. I was hired by the Hawthorne Family Trust at the age of 38, and I have done it every week since. The cemetery is on a hillside, about 6 miles from the nearest town, a private road. The Hawthorne family goes back in those mountains to the early 1800s. The cemetery has been receiving family members since approximately 1831. When I started the work, there were 63 stones. There are now 71. I have been present for 8 of those additions, and I have been present for things that do not go into the official record, because the official record is maintained by the family trust, and the family trust wants to know about drainage issues and stone deterioration and groundskeeping costs, not what I'm about to tell you. First observation, which I made in my 3rd month of work: the cemetery has a section in the southeast corner, 6 stones, all from the 1,840 seconds and 1,850 seconds, the oldest section. In summer, when the sun is high and direct, the stones in that section are warm to the touch. Stone holds heat, that's expected. But the stones in the southeast corner are warm before the sun reaches them. I first noticed it on a July morning, arriving at the cemetery at 7 a.m. before the sun had cleared the ridge to the east. The southeast section was still in full shadow. I walked through that section and put my hand on a stone. Warm, not the ambient warmth of a mild morning, warm the way a stone gets after hours of direct sun. I checked every stone in every other section, all cool, appropriate for a stone in morning shade. Only the southeast corner was warm. I noted it in my private log. I have measured it systematically on the first day of every month for 40 years. The southeast corner stones are warm before sunrise on every single measurement, no exception in 40 years. No identified heat source beneath that section. The family trust had a geothermal assessment done in 2009 when I raised it as a maintenance concern without specifying the reason. No geothermal activity identified. The stones are warm before sunrise. They have been warm before sunrise for at least 40 years, almost certainly longer. Second observation, which I made in my 7th year. March 17th, that date specifically, because it has been March 17th for 33 consecutive years now, and I have noted it 33 times. On March 17th of each year, the ground in the northeast section of the cemetery shows fresh disturbance, not dramatic disturbance, not excavation, the specific surface disturbance of ground that has experienced movement from below, small heaves in the turf, the kind of thing that could be attributed to frost heave, except that it occurs consistently in a specific section rather than distributed across the ground. And except that March 17th is rarely the coldest night of the year, frost heave typically happens in February, and the disturbance is always, without exception, in a diamond-shaped pattern approximately 8 feet by 6 feet, the precise dimensions of a standard burial. There is no recorded burial in that location. I have checked the family records. No burial has been made in that section of the northeast corner in the history of the cemetery. But every year on March 17th, The ground in that spot heaves in the pattern of something moving beneath it. I repair the turf every year on March 18th. I have repaired it 33 times. Third observation, which came in my 12th year, and which I have verified annually since, there is a stone in the west section. A man named Thomas died 1887. A standard carved tablet stone of that period. I know this stone well. I clean it twice a year. I know every characteristic of its surface. In summer light, the stone reads as it reads on any documentation of it. Thomas, his dates, a brief verse. In winter light, specifically in the low-angle gray light of overcast December and January days, the stone reads differently. Not because the carving is different. The carving is the same. But the angle of the winter light catches something the summer light doesn't. A name beneath the name, carved at the same depth, in the same style, into the same stone. A different name, not Thomas. I traced it the first time with my finger to make sure I was reading it correctly. A different name, carved into the same stone, visible only in the specific low-angle light of 2 months out of 12. A woman's name. I have looked for any record of that woman in the family history. She is not documented. She is not in any Hawthorne family record I have access to. But she is in the stone every December and January, under Thomas, waiting for the right light. Fourth observation, and I want to be careful about how I describe this one because it is the one I find most difficult to account for professionally. There is a corner of the east section that my dog would not enter. I had a dog for 14 years, a good working dog, a cattle dog mix who accompanied me to the cemetery every week for all 14 years of his life. He was not a nervous animal. He was not easily disturbed. He walked through the cemetery without incident in every section, except the east corner. Specifically, a 2-stone area in the east corner, 2 stones from the 1,860 the stones of a woman and her infant child who died the same year. My dog would not walk into the 2-stone area. Not wouldn't, couldn't. He would approach to a specific point, approximately 6 feet from the nearest stone, and stop. He would lower his head. He would not bark. He would not growl. He would simply stand at the 6-foot perimeter and refuse to move closer. I tested this many times, walking into the area myself and calling him. He would stand at the perimeter. He would look at me. He would not come. He died at 14, as dogs do, and I have not had another dog since. But I have walked through that 2-stone area many thousands of times in 40 years, and I will tell you honestly, I understand why he stopped. I understand exactly why he stopped. I have kept these observations private for 40 years. The family trust pays me to maintain the ground, not to interpret it. And these observations are not maintenance concerns. They are observations. I'm telling them now because I'm 78 years old, and I have been in that cemetery every week for 40 years. And if I don't tell someone what I've witnessed in that time, then it goes with me. And it shouldn't go with me. This ground deserves to have its record kept, all of its record. Not just the stones and the drainage and the grass. What the stones do before sunrise, what the ground does on March 17th, what is written beneath Thomas, and why a good dog stood at a 6-foot perimeter and looked at me with steady eyes that said, I know you're going to go in there anyway. I know you always do. And I will wait right here until you come back out. He always waited. I always came back out. The cemetery is still there. I go every week. I will go every week until I can't. And then I'll be on the other side of the record. And someone else will have to keep it, hey, right here before Everett finishes. If tonight's content is what you come here for, hit subscribe right now. Every week, more real stories, more true accounts from people who have stood in places like this and come back with something they needed to tell. Drop a comment. Tell me which of Everett's 4 observations gets to you the most. The warm stones before sunrise. March 17th, every year. The name beneath Thomas, or why the dog knew exactly where to stop. Let him finish. Then we have one more story tonight. I want to be precise about our methodology before I tell you what we found, because the methodology is what eliminates the most obvious explanation, which is that we misread the stones on the first visit, or the photographs failed to capture the carving correctly, or the low light or the angle or the camera settings produced an inaccurate image. We use the same equipment every visit, the same lighting protocol, the same positioning relative to each stone, the same settings. We have documented hundreds of Appalachian cemeteries using this protocol, and our results are consistent and reproducible. We did not misread the stones. We did not photograph them incorrectly. 7 stones showed different names between our first and second visit. The names changed. And when we found out whose names they were, I wish I could say the change seemed random. It didn't. My name is Archer. I'm 44. Zola is my wife and research partner. We've been documenting remote Appalachian cemeteries for 8 years as an independent preservation project. The work is straightforward and important. Hundreds of family cemeteries in these mountains are deteriorating with no formal documentation. We photograph every stone, transcribe every inscription, map the site, and deposit the records with the State Historical Society. We visited the Combs Family Cemetery in a remote hollow in western West Virginia in late April. Our first visit, a full documentation session, 58 stones, approximately 4 hours of careful systematic work, standard session, good results. We returned in late July, 3 months later, to complete some additional work on the perimeter and rephotograph 3 stones where our first images had been partially obscured by shadow. Zola was doing the perimeter work. I was rephotographing the 3 target stones. The third target stone was in the northeast section. A man named Ezra died 1904. I photographed it and reviewed the image. The name on the stone was not Ezra. I stood at the stone and looked at it with my eyes, and it said Ezra. I looked at my camera screen and it said a different name. I looked at the stone again, Ezra. I photographed it again. The camera showed the different name. I went and got Zola. She looked at the stone. She said Ezra. I showed her the camera screen. She took the camera and photographed the stone herself. The camera showed the different name. We stood there for a moment. Then Zola said, "Pull up the April photographs." I pulled up the April session on my camera. The April photograph of that stone showed Ezra, clearly, exactly as it appeared to our eyes now. The July photograph of the same stone showed a different name. Same stone, same carving, different photograph, 3 months apart. Zola said, "Check the others." We went through every stone in the cemetery, systematically photographing each one, reviewing each image, comparing to the April session. 51 stones, identical between April and July. 7 stones different, not slightly different, not a letter changed or a date variant, completely different names. The carving style, the depth of cut, the weathering, all consistent with the original stone. But the names photographed in July were not the names that had been photographed in April. We documented all 7 discrepancies. 7 stones showing names in July that had not been there in April. 7 names that had not been on those stones when we'd first visited. We drove home that evening, and I called Dr. Yuen, a professor of Appalachian history and material culture at a regional university who had been a resource for our project on several occasions. I described the discrepancy without suggesting an explanation. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Read me the 7 July names." I read them, another silence, longer. He said, "Give me a few days." He called back 4 days later. He said, "I need to tell you something about all 7 of those names." I said, "Tell me." He said, "All 7 are documented in historical records of that region. Deaths, all between 1,890 and 1,940, all in that general area of western West Virginia." I said, "They're in the family records? The Combs family?" He said, "No, that's what I'm trying to tell you. None of them are Combs family members. They're not related to anyone buried in that cemetery." I said, "Then why are their names on those stones?" He said, "They're not on the stones as far as we can see. They're in your photographs." A pause. He said, "These 7 people have something in common. Are you ready for this?" I said, "Yes." He said, "All 7 died in that area of the mountains and were never buried. 3 drownings, bodies not recovered. 2 deaths in remote terrain, bodies not found. One death, whose circumstances were never fully documented, remains never located. One woman who walked into the forest in the winter of 1923 and was never seen again. He said, all 7 people died in those mountains without a grave. I sat with that for a long time. Zola was across the table. I put the phone on speaker so she could hear. Dr. Ewan said, I don't know what to do with this academically. I don't know what the right framework is. Zola said, what if the stones hold names temporarily for people who need them? Dr. Yuen said, I don't have a framework for that. Zola said, 7 people died without graves in those mountains. 7 stones in a family cemetery 3 months apart show their names instead of the family names. She said, what if the stones were being used temporarily by people who didn't have their own? A long silence, then Dr. Ewan said, has anyone documented this behavior in Appalachian cemeteries before? Stones showing different names at different visits? I said, not that we've found. He said, have you gone back a 3rd time? I said, not yet. He said, what do you think you'll find? We went back in October, 3rd visit. We photographed every stone. The 7 stones that had shown the changed names in July showed their original names in October, all 7 back to the Combs family names. And in the carving of 2 of those 7, barely visible, less than a millimeter deep, the ghost of something beneath the original carving. We used raking light to photograph those 2. The ghost carving beneath was consistent with what we'd photographed in July. The borrowed names pressed into the stone lightly, temporarily, and then gone. But not completely gone. The stone remembered, the way stones remember everything that is pressed into them long enough. I've thought about those 7 people for 2 years. 3 who drowned in those mountains and whose bodies the water kept. 2 who died in remote terrain and whose remains the forest kept. 1 whose circumstances the records never resolved. 1 woman who walked into the winter and didn't come back. 7 people who died in the Appalachians and never had a stone for 3 months. In a Combs family cemetery, in a hollow in western West Virginia, they had stones. 7 of them borrowed, the family names stepping aside to make room. And then in October, the family names back. And beneath 2 of them, just barely, just enough for raking light to find, the ghost of someone who had rested there for a season and moved on. I think about where they moved on to. I think about whether there's a place in those mountains, something in the 480 million years of that ground, that eventually collects everyone who dies in it. Every person the mountains keep. Every name without a stone. I think those 7 people found what they were looking for. For 3 months in a family cemetery in a hollow, they had names on stones. They had graves, they were counted, and then they were done. And the stones gave the names back, and the ground kept the rest. 3 Appalachian graveyards. A stone that shows each person who reads it something different. A name, a date, a door that can be walked past. 2 lines at the bottom that keep adding to themselves. A caretaker who has kept 40 years of private observations about warm stones, and March 17th, and what is written beneath Thomas, and where a good dog knew to stop, and 7 headstones that held borrowed names for 3 months. The names of people who died in those mountains without graves, and then returned the names when the borrowing was done. Here's what all 3 of these share. The stones are not passive. That's the thing that gets me, thinking about all 3 of these. We treat headstones as records, as markers, as the last word. You carve the name, you carve the dates, and the stone holds them until the stone is gone. But these stones are doing something more than holding. Rosalind's stone was reading her and responding to what it found. Everett's stone was doing something different in winter light than in summer light, holding more than one name, deciding which one to show depending on what came to look. And 7 stones in a West Virginia hollow were lending themselves temporarily the way you lend a room to someone who needs it, to people who died in the mountains and needed somewhere to be. In the Appalachians, the ground is old enough to have developed opinions, and the stones it holds are old enough to have learned from it. They know who comes to read them. They know what those people need. They know which names to show. And they know when the season is right and the light is right and someone died without a place to be remembered. How to make room. Good night.